introduce Dr. Kimberly Nicholas as our keynote speaker for this year. Dr. Kimberly is an associate professor. Gracious, I'm sorry, I'm getting excited. She is an associate professor of sustainability science at Lund University, which is the highest ranked university in Sweden. She's also the director of PhD studies at Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies. She has published more than 50 articles on climate and sustainability in leading peer-reviewed journals, and her research has been featured in outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, USA Today, and more. Very prestigious, and we're very excited to have you here. She was born and raised on her family's vineyard in Sonoma, California, and she studied the effect of climate change on the California wine industry for her PhD in environment and resources at Stanford University. In her research, she studied the connections between people, land, and climate. Her goal is to understand how to manage land and resources to support a good life for everyone alive today and leave a thriving planet for future generations. So everyone join me in a virtual hand clap of welcoming our keynote, Kimberly. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type it into the chat so that we're not interrupting there, and we will we'll have Jackie and Cecilia to facilitate those questions at the close of Kimberly's presentation. So then you'll get a chance to type more questions into the chat, or maybe unmute yourself and elaborate on those questions there at the end. So without further ado, please feel free to take it away, Dr. Nicholas.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bailey. Thanks for having me. Let me turn on my screen sharing here and make sure you all get a good view. So I'm joining you, as Bailey said, from Sweden, and so it's afternoon here, but it's really nice to be with you for morning for you, where I am really excited to be able to join a group of citizen scientists and be able to share some research from myself and my colleagues. Let me see, actually, sorry, I want to get this in full screen. Apologies, we should be better at this by now. Okay, so Bailey, do you see my full screen and you hear me well?
Yes.
Thumbs up. Perfect. Okay, great, perfect. Thanks, everybody. So today I'm going to share with you a framing that I've used for a little while now in my teaching, and especially in my new book, which is actually launching a week from today. I have it on the bookshelf behind me, and it's right here. Under the Sky We Make is the title of my book. I'm very excited. Thank you, Bailey. And I think basically in the book, I'm arguing that we need these three ingredients to face and to solve the climate crisis: facts, feelings, and action. So that's what I'll take you through today. We'll start with the facts. I am a scientist, so let's agree on facts. So here I've summed up thousands of studies over decades to what my friend Denise calls the Climate Haiku. For those who are real haiku aficionados, you'll notice it's one syllable off, but it's very close. And this is really what everybody needs to know about climate change, which is it's warming, it's us, we are sure, it's bad, but very importantly, we can fix it. And this is what I'm summing up here as the key takeaways from the Ipcc, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's a group of hundreds of scientists who a couple times a decade synthesize the literature and the latest science and sum up what we know about the climate. And they are in different working groups, which you see here, but this is the key takeaway. So if you want all the footnotes and the references, I have them on my protest sign in the corner there, and I have them in my book, but these are really well established. So that's kind of our shared starting point. Unfortunately, the point number 4, it's bad. It's actually really bad. And we see this now in unfolding in real time. And I think all of us, especially those of you who are spending a lot of time in the outdoors, are monitoring the situation with nature. You will have seen this firsthand, signs of both climate warming and its attendant effects on nature and on the direct destruction and pollution of nature itself. But we know now that 1.5 degrees of warming is a really critical limit for life on Earth, both for people and nature. We've already warmed the planet a little more than 1 degree Celsius, and we see very widespread effects already throughout the US and the rest of the world from the warming we've had today. And we know that we are in really a race against time to stabilize the climate in time to avoid really catastrophic and devastating effects. And this image here shows, for example, what 2 to 3 degrees of warming looks like on coral reefs, some of the most beautiful and diverse ecosystems. And this is just kind of a canary in the coal mine, or a sample of the kinds of changes that seemingly small differences of 1 or 2 degrees. It doesn't sound like much, but for life on Earth, it's a huge, huge difference. Some of you may have remember the headline from May 2019 that 1 million species are now at risk of extinction from human activities. And that is really unprecedented. We are at risk of wiping out our fellow life on Earth. And we're seeing very rapid changes. We know that humans are driving a number of global changes, not only climate change, but actually in terms of species and biodiversity. Climate change isn't even the first risk on the list. You see here this Ipcc report from now about 2 years ago showing its land and sea use change, so direct habitat change, that is the #1 driver of the destruction and degradation of nature. And then followed by direct exploitation, so things like fishing and capturing and directly using plants and animals. But the climate change is also doing its part. So it's really a tough time for life on Earth at the moment, which I think you're well aware of. This shows here how humans are currently using land. And I think the really stunning thing is just how our one species, we're one of about 8 million species on Earth, and how very overwhelmingly we've come to dominate the whole planet. So with ice-free land on Earth being 100% here, you see that people are using about 12% to grow crops. That's an area about the size of South America. We use about more than a third, 37%, for pasture, so grazing animals. That's about the size of the continent of Africa. And altogether, when you count up the other ways that humans are using the planet, there's a whole nother North America in there. So basically, there's very little space left for nature. And you can kind of just hear nature saying, "Oh, gee, thanks, you left me this other land, barren rock, 12%. That's really nice of you." But we're really overrunning the healthy forests and streams and ecosystems that species need to survive. And this also has climate consequences, as I've highlighted here. About a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions that are causing the warming that we're experiencing now come from how we use land, primarily from agriculture and also deforestation. This has really hit close to home for me. I come from, as Bailey mentioned, from the town of Sonoma, which is about an hour north of San Francisco in California. In the last 5 years there have been devastating wildfires every year. My family has actually been evacuated in 2017. We were worried that we would need to evacuate again this past year, last summer 2020, when my dad was just back from the hospital recovering from surgery and COVID and not able to evacuate. So that was a really, really scary time. Thankfully, my family is safe, they were okay, but there are many others, as this man in the picture, who are not. And we know that the kinds of fires that we're experiencing now in California, like other extreme weather events that are happening around the country and around the world, are exacerbated and made more devastating, more likely, bigger and more dangerous and more frequent by human-caused climate warming. So unlike what this man is saying in the picture, it's like God has no sympathy. It's not even really a natural disaster, certainly not a purely natural disaster anymore. Humans are making these kinds of disasters much more likely, and that means we're causing a lot of suffering in our communities, and it is really devastating to see. So this is a big motivation for me to be so involved in trying to turn things around. This map just shows the scale. For those of you, if you can see my mouse here, here's San Francisco, here's Marin County, here's where my family is from in the Sonoma area and Napa, wine country you may have heard of, where I was doing my PhD work, as Bailey mentioned. And you just see the scale of wildfires since 2015, where the light gray areas that burned over more than 100 years, close to 150 years, which was very, very small, partly from fire suppression. So, I mean, prescribed burns and managed burns are an important part of fire management. But, we know that also the climate warming and the droughts that we've experienced are making these kind of fires much more likely, more dangerous, and more devastating. So just as a kind of an early sum up of key takeaways, life on Earth is in big trouble. We're alive in a really critical time. And we have this window now, the next few years, where we still have so much to save and to fight for. And it's really important that we don't miss this opportunity. So it's really up to us to fix it. We can't wait for anyone else because that will be too late. Our challenge today is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So very quickly stop using fossil fuels and change the way we use nature and land to achieve that. We need to halt biodiversity loss, and I'm sure that's near and dear to many of your hearts. Aquatic systems having suffered very greatly in the biodiversity crisis. So protecting and restoring ecosystems is a really critical priority. And alongside these critical priorities for nature, we have to also center human well-being. And I think we need to be having more conversations about what it is that we value, what it is that we care about, that we're protecting. And those are not really scientific questions. Those are questions about more philosophical. But I think those are really necessary and important to kind of recenter the conversation on what is this all about, because there's so much at stake at this moment. So what does that look like when we talk about the first point there, stabilize the climate? What will it take to stabilize the climate? What science tells us is we actually have to get to zero emissions of especially carbon pollution. So some carbon pollution lasts in the atmosphere more than 10,000 years. So if you picture Stonehenge or the Great Pyramids of Giza, some of the quite ancient, recognizably human constructions, those are around 5,000 years old, both of them. So they've lasted about half as long as some of the carbon that we emit today will last in the atmosphere. So the carbon we're emitting is a huge part of the legacy we're leaving on Earth. And as long as it's in the atmosphere, it continues to cause warming. So the goal of the Paris Agreement here is to stabilize the climate basically well below 2 degrees of warming compared with pre-industrial, before humans started warming the climate, and pursuing efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. So somewhere between 1.5 and 2 is what we have in governments of the world, our elected representatives and negotiators have agreed to, and that's what we're now committed to doing. And that means we have to peak greenhouse gases, which I'll show in a second, and very, very quickly reduce. And that is something we've been putting off for a long time, and the job just keeps getting bigger. So we can't put it off anymore. If we imagine, just to kind of get some intuition for why is it we have to go all the way to zero, we can imagine the atmosphere like a bathtub, and the faucet represents sources of climate pollution, like cars and planes and burning fossil fuels. The sinks, the drain, is carbon removed from the atmosphere. And at the moment, nature is cleaning up about half of our carbon mess for free. So you can imagine that if you turn on the faucet and plug the drain, or as long as there's more coming in than is being removed, the level in the bathtub is going to rise. And that's the situation today. We have more emissions than removals, and that means our CO2 level is going up. This edge of the bathtub represents our carbon budget. So that's the amount we can emit and stay below 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming. And here you just see the sources and sinks. Very important, as I said, to protect and restore ecosystems and take care of nature. But I think increasingly the evidence is that it is risky to rely on nature to clean up our mess. We basically have to eliminate these sources of emissions up here and not count on nature cleaning up after the fact. There are many reasons to doubt that it will actually be possible for nature to undo the harm we've done from fossil fuels, basically. So protecting nature for biodiversity, for cultural reasons, for health, and many other reasons is very, very critical. But I think we shouldn't count on nature to do our work of going fossil free as a carbon sink for us. Let's see if I managed to show this video. So some colleagues at the Global Carbon Project have put together, instead of a bathtub, a bucket representing the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. And I'll play it now, but what it shows is just how very fast we've been using up our remaining budget and how little remains. Oh, sorry. Oh, spoiler alert. So this is now, a little over a year old. And at that time, less than 9% of the budget was available, less than 10 years of the budget remaining. So this is why this time is so critical, because by 2030 or even before 2030, we will have used up all the available budget that is for all of humanity for all of time, since carbon essentially lasts forever. So that's why our job is so big and so urgent right now. And here's a visualization of kind of where we are and where we need to be. So emissions have been going up for a long time. There was a dip last year due to the pandemic, which is of course not a reason that anyone would want emissions to go down. What we need now is to take advantage of the chance to develop new policies, implement new recovery packages to actually make sure that those align with climate stability. And that means planning to close down polluting industries and unsustainable practices, and instead support the ones that actually are compatible with a stable and safe climate. So that is unfortunately not the track we're on at the moment. Current emissions have been continuing to go up. The pledges and policies, or targets rather, so far are only a very small amount below where we would be without, there's only a little bit kind of that we can expect current policies and pledges to do. And compared with where you see we need really big and sharp reductions, about 25% reduction by 2030 to meet the 2.2 degree goal, and at least 50% reduction to be consistent with 1.5. So bottom line is we need to cut global emissions about in half in the next 10 years. And that is a really big job, but it is doable and we just have to do it. So if we look at, okay, where are the emissions coming from? Because we need to know what we need to cut. The majority, especially for carbon, which is the longest lived greenhouse gas and causes the majority of warming, most of that carbon comes from burning fossil fuels, so coal, oil, and gas. So it's used to heat and light and cool homes, move cars and trains and people around, and for aviation. Gas is used mostly for heating. And then we have land use change. So carbon, most methane and nitrous oxide, some of the other major greenhouse gases come from agriculture, and methane especially from livestock. But carbon itself mostly comes from ecosystems, from land use disturbance, and definitely is much smaller than the contribution from fossil fuels. So that's what has been happening, this very sharp filling of the bucket and increase of the curve. What needs to happen is a very quick and we did actually decrease emissions globally last year, but as I said, for the wrong reasons due to human suffering. That is not the path we want to be on in terms of, we want emissions to be going to zero while protecting or even increasing human well-being. What this shows is very depressing to me, that basically during my career over the last 20 years or so, we could have had a much easier task ahead of us if we had gotten started sooner. Basically, keeping within the carbon budget, we could have reduced much more gradually if we had started earlier. But we're now at the point where we have put things off so long that we need this very, very steep reduction to be on track. And in a nutshell, we know what we have to do to stop climate change. Basically, we have to leave fossil fuels in the ground. We have to stop transferring this ancient fossil carbon from below ground in the form of coal, oil, and gas, these geological reserves in brown that we're currently adding to the atmosphere, this little orange bar. That bit of the cycle needs to be broken or disconnected. And it means that you need to stop both production and consumption of fossil fuel, the whole chain, because the atmosphere really doesn't care if it's supply or demand driven, if it's, the atmosphere doesn't know what policies we have, it doesn't know what we're buying and shipping around the world, it just sees the carbon that we emit. So we have to look along this whole chain and use every tool that we possibly can and resource that we have at our disposal to quickly and fairly leave fossil fuels in the ground. So that is both on the production and extraction and shipping and exploration side, these major industries that have a very infuriating history, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But it's also within every, so there's oil and gas, but it's also within every industry, within every sector, if it's agriculture or business or cement and steel or production. Everyone has a role to play. And it's also us consumers. And one important thing that this graph shows, which we'll spend a little more time on in a minute, is the final demand. So where all this stuff is going, most of it goes to households. Most goods and services and activities that burn fossil fuels are ultimately consumed by consumers. And we'll look at that in more detail and see that that's a very unequal distribution. So much more is going to consumers and households than to, for example, consumption by government or capital formation and investments. So we all have a role to play here, and I'll talk more about that. So leaving fossil fuels in the ground is kind of step 1 through 7, or that's like the top of the list. We also really need to protect and restore ecosystems, which is some of the work that you are already doing. So that is really critical and important. It can help potentially in taking up more carbon from the atmosphere and in maintaining and continuing to store the carbon that's already in those ecosystems that plants have taken up through photosynthesis and become part of soils and ecosystems. But again, as I said, I think we shouldn't be thinking about ecosystems as machines to take up trees. They're living systems that have relationships that are built on relationships and being healthy and intact. So that is maybe more of our focus there. So I kind of elaborate these principles and try to develop them and give examples of them throughout my book. But basically, it boils down to the mindset shift that I think we need to actually stabilize the climate, protect nature. Involves prioritizing and respecting both people and nature, realizing how interconnected we are and how essential both are. That we get to the root of problems, that we don't just treat their symptoms, but we actually stop harm at the source. So rather than trying to clean up a mess after the fact, we think about how to prevent it and design systems that are waste-free and climate safe from the beginning. And then build resilience. We are already living in a climate changed world, and we need to protect and enhance the coping capacity of the most vulnerable people and species to make sure we're taking care of each other. So that was facts. I'll talk a little bit about feelings. I write a lot about this in the book. I haven't made it a huge part of this talk, but if you want to see me emote, you can certainly read more. I guess I actually just want to tell a story. So this was Sweden's tallest mountain, Kebnekaise. And these two artists, Bigert and Bergström, who are based in Stockholm, did a project called a rescue blanket for Kebnekaise. So the idea was, it's been known for years that the glacier on top of this mountain is melting. And it was predicted that Sweden's highest peak would not exist anymore soon based on the rate of melt. So their art installation was to hike up there and install this reflective blanket to try and save or preserve some of the ice on top of the mountain. And to me, this was so moving and devastating. I saw this exhibit in my local museum a few years ago, and the scale of what they were trying to do. I mean, they were really making more of a statement than thinking that this was going to be the decisive factor that saves the top of the mountain. But realizing what a huge impact across the world people are having through our climate pollution, and these kind of the ineffectiveness basically of working at the end of the pipeline and trying to clean up the problem rather than prevent it at the beginning. So in 2019, my husband and I actually hiked this mountain. It was not nearly this snowy. It was in the summer. And so we were able to walk almost all the way up on paths. At the very top, there still was this glacier. And I made it to probably, I guess it was about this field right here. So, a few meters below the very top. But I didn't have crampons. And this is a very steep and slippery slope down, which I later read will result in certain death if you fall. So I felt like less of a wimp for deciding not to go without crampons. My husband went up safely and made it down, and I was a bit jealous. But anyway, I thought, okay, I can always come back next year. But actually I can't, because that happened to be the year that the glacier actually did melt and was measured to melt. So much so that it is not the tallest mountain in Sweden anymore. That honor now goes to this rocky peak, just a short distance away, kind of the second peak of the mountain, which is not covered by snow and has remained in the summer and has remained the same height. So I just missed my chance to climb Sweden's highest mountains, and we now have to redraw the maps. And kids in school need to learn something new. And I mean, the culture and the traditions of this place are really tied to this. And I think this is a very small but concrete example of the kind of losses that we're already living through in this age of climate change. And I think acknowledging that, I mean, especially as an environmental scientist, I mean, I and my colleagues went into our fields because, you know, in my case, because I love nature, I love being outside and hiking around in the mountains. And I realized in college that was what researchers did. And I thought that sounded really fun. And it is, and it has been really fun, but it has also been kind of like a decades-long funeral to observe the decline and the death, in some cases, of the things and places that I love. So I think acknowledging how hard this work is really important, to be able to support each other, to realize, yeah, what's at stake in this time that we're going through together, and find ways to keep going and supporting each other. And I guess along those lines, I've come up with this, what I call these, the 5 stages of radical climate acceptance. And I just want to be really clear, when I'm talking about acceptance, I'm not talking about doomism. I'm not saying it's too late, because it's not. What I'm saying is being able to view reality as it is without distortions or judgments, and to fight like hell to change what we can't, and accept and tolerate and support each other in living with the things that we can't. So I think for me, this has been really important to sort of stop avoiding the negative feelings that sometimes come with doing this difficult work, because I think that's blocking a lot of collaboration and action that we really need. So just briefly, these 5 stages, they start with ignorance. I mean, no one is born with an inborn knowledge that humans are changing the climate. That's something we have to learn from parents or teachers or books or some source. I think next often comes, and this isn't just a straight line, but I'll just describe it as that briefly. Next is, and very common, and I've done this myself, is avoidance, that it's uncomfortable to face these big, difficult, scary truths. And at some point it becomes less uncomfortable to actually face them than to keep hiding or minimizing or turning away from them. And then I think there's a very often a slippery slope to doom, where the problem feels really overwhelming. It feels like nothing I do could possibly matter or make enough of a difference. And I think acknowledging that and acknowledging the tough parts is the way through. So that's stage 4, all the feels. And I mean, they're not all negative, but I think some of them are tough, and not being, you know, afraid to face those feelings of anger or sadness or guilt or mourning or whatever the experience. Anxiety, climate anxiety is a big one. Whatever that experience looks like for you, I think we can help each other get through that, because by doing so, we can get to this 5th stage, which is purpose, which is basically figuring out what is it that I can contribute to this critical goal of climate stabilization, because we really need everybody from all parts of the world with all different talents and all different backgrounds and points of view to come together and be working on this problem and creating the solutions and actually putting them into practice. So yeah, that's what a lot of, I think that's why I think that the feelings are kind of the bridge from the facts to action. They can be the motivation and the inspiration that we need to actually identify and live our values through our actions. And that is really empowering. Well, one more feeling. Here's a quotation. There's still time to save the world's peoples from the catastrophic consequences of fossil fuel pollution, but time is running out. I don't know if we're well set up. I can't see the chat. So, you know, usually I ask for guesses, and the most popular guesses are Al Gore or Barack Obama. And so that would have been, you know, around 2000, mid 2005 or 2007 for Al Gore, and maybe 2014 for Barack Obama. But actually, it was before I was born that this statement was made, and it was made by the president of the American Petroleum Institute. So learning this from a study a couple years ago made me so angry, because it's been demonstrated both by researchers and by investigative journalism, by lawsuits and legal research, how much denial and delay has been a part of the oil industry, basically, in their strategy. And I won't go more into it, but I write a lot about that in the book. And I think, it's absolutely inexcusable. But a big part of the reason why we are so deep in this hole of climate pollution and facing such scary and risks and already experiencing such damages is part of a strategy. And that's a really, really infuriating and terrible thing to realize. So what do we do with that anger? Well, and all those other feelings. As I said, it's not that we're trying to get rid of them, or that's not how I see it, but I think these feelings can empower action. And once we know from the facts of science where we want to go, and we know from the values and feelings that we hold and that we discuss and develop in our communities, we know what's important to us to protect, that helps us point towards action. So who is it that needs to act? Well, this was now 7 years ago, almost, in Copenhagen at one of the second actually climate protests that I went to. And here was this 8-year-old girl who bravely got up in front of this big crowd and told us that she dreamed of studying the oceans, but she was afraid the ocean may be dead when she grows up. And to me, this is so heartbreaking. And also to realize now, this young woman is a high school teenager because enough time has passed and we haven't, met her demands, or we haven't, given her the world that she deserves and is asking for, which is one where she can dream of studying the oceans when she grows up. So I think I'll come back to this, but I think it's definitely a mistake to put the burden of action or of hope or political agitation on young people, not to diminish in any way the incredible work that they're doing. And I think they're having a huge effect. But basically, if you listen to young people, their ask is for adults and people in power. And we all have probably much more power than we realize or use, to use our power to actually put in practice what we need to stabilize the climate. So I think she deserves that. What this shows, another graph saying how very far reality is from where we actually need to be. So this lonely, empty corner of the graph in the upper left corner, the circle, that is sustainability. That is, this study was looking at indicators of social and environmental sustainability. So environmental sustainability is on across the horizontal axis, and social sustainability is the vertical. And so what we want is not exceeding any planetary boundaries or environmental sustainability limits, but fulfilling all the critical requirements for human well-being, like education, sanitation, healthcare, social support, democratic quality, and so on. So basically what this says is a very depressing finding, that there is so far basically one path where countries go from not using many resources, but not meeting the needs and rights of their people, to vastly overusing resources, countries like Sweden and the US and Japan, but meeting human needs. And so the challenge of our lifetimes basically is to get all of these dots, all of these countries around the world to converge into this upper left corner right now. So for countries like the US and Sweden, that means maintaining and enhancing education and healthcare and these critical elements for well-being, and dramatically decreasing our use of environmental resources. And for countries like Morocco and Sri Lanka, it means maintaining, probably increasing somewhat their resource use to be able to meet everyone's needs, but maintaining consumption within sustainable boundaries and increasing human well-being dramatically. So that's kind of the mechanism of sustainable development. That's what we're aiming for. I want to talk a little bit about inequality. This comes from Hans Rosling, who wrote the book Factfulness, and his kids have actually carried on his work after his death a few years ago and collaborated for a long time. But basically, I think it's important to sort of realize, okay, if we, with a little bit of rounding, there are around 7 billion people that we share the planet with right now. That's represented by those yellow figures at the bottom. And about 1 billion people live in incredible poverty, less than $2 a day as income. And you see that their life is very, very hard. And they certainly do not have what they need to meet basic human needs. They don't have clean water. They might not even have shoes. They don't have healthy and safe food and a secure place to sleep. So a critical priority for sustainable development is lifting people out of poverty. Most people on Earth are at what Hans Rosling calls level 2 or level 3. So level 2 on average is like India. Level 3 is the average standard of China. And there you see a very rapid increase in resources and meeting needs. And then there's around 1 billion people, I'm going to guess including everyone listening right now, and certainly myself, who have enjoy this very high standard of living. And it's really important. I'm going to talk about who should do what basically to fix climate change. And I think it's really important to realize and sort of zero in on essentially the responsibility and the carbon or climate privilege that comes with being in this group that has historically enjoyed the most comforts and convenience and benefits from fossil fuel development, and now has the ability, both financial and otherwise, to help make this transition happen. And it's really on us to do this first and fastest. What we see here from a report a couple months ago from the UN Environment Programme is similar to the previous graph. The divisions are slightly different, but the point remains the same, that basically most emissions, consumer or household emissions, come from this top 10% of income earners. And that roughly corresponds to that top 1 billion people or so, give or take, in the past graph. So if you're on a lower income level than that, we're not talking about you needing to reduce your emissions. And you see even here around just above 2 tons per person per year is about where we need to be on track for the 1.5 goal. The average in the US right now is something like 10 times higher than this. So we have an enormous job ahead of us in the next decade to actually make this happen. But the very lowest emitters in the bottom 50%, those were the people in the last graph who don't have shoes, who are cooking over open fires. And in their case, they need to increase emissions slightly to be able to meet their needs and have security. So we're not talking about emissions reductions or personal lifestyle changes to reduce consumption for the poorest. But on the other hand, personal changes are going to be necessary and are essential for this group of high income and therefore high emitting individuals. And that certainly includes me. This is another way to look at it, similar data this time just for Europe. But again, the pattern is really consistent. There tends to be this kind of very disproportionate emission pattern where, again, the top 10% this time in Europe are responsible for the majority of household emissions, or a very disproportionate amount of household emissions. And when you look at where do those emissions come from, you see that actually travel by land, which is basically cars, and planes, especially for this top income group, become the majority of emissions. So if we talk about needing to cut emissions at least in half by 2030, we need to cut emissions today and going forward very quickly. This is kind of the lowest hanging fruit. People who fly a lot and who drive a lot, reducing that to a fair level would do an enormous amount for reducing emissions. But again, I'm not pointing the finger or suggesting that personal changes are needed from middle and low income groups, because I think that would be unfair and it would also be ineffective. There's just not that many emissions there to reduce. So to address the emissions that remain for these groups, we need to make the systemic changes to policies and infrastructure and incentives in order for society to be moving towards zero emissions as a whole. So that's just an important distinction I think often gets lost. So, okay, we said, I'll try to go quickly here and wrap up and leave some time for questions. We said that, or we saw the data that showed that flying and driving were some of the two highest sources of emissions for high income folks. So slowing down and staying grounded, like these pictures of car-free cities and days of being car-free show, actually, this doesn't look so terrible. This might be really nice. Having, kids able to play on streets, neighbors able to, well, as soon as it's safe to do so, with the pandemic situation hopefully improving, being able to have these sort of outdoor convivial spaces looks pretty lovely. And I have a confession to make. I'm a recovering frequent flyer. So in 2010, which was my peak flying year, I took 15 round trip flights. So I was very much in this top group of high emitters. I didn't really have the income to support it, but I was in a group that basically in academia, I think there's a lot of pressure and expectation, or at least there was before the pandemic, to fly a lot, to go to conferences, to give talks like this, to give research talks, to meet people. And of course, I love the contact and networking and new experiences, but increasingly felt this, stage 2 of all the climate fields of avoidance, avoiding this cognitive dissonance, this uncomfortable feeling, knowing that I was flying way more than average or way more than my carbon budget allowed. Meanwhile, I was one of the, best informed about the problem, and I knew how serious it was. So I decided in 2012 to follow the example of my friend Charlie, and I stopped flying within Europe. And so that was, I didn't want to give up the flight home to see my family, and that had prevented me from thinking about ever addressing any of my flying. But when Charlie told me that was how he had handled it, that seemed like something I could do. And that's meant that I've reduced my flying, again, in non-pandemic times, more than 90%. So this is my expired frequent flyer card. It's now in a museum called Carbon Ruins, which is a museum from 2053, looking back on the bizarre artifacts of the fossil age, which by then we have thankfully left behind and are moving past. I think I've said this, so I might skip this part. This is just some of our research led by Seth Wines a few years ago, saying how big and important going car, flight, and meat-free are to quickly reduce. If we're in that high income and high emission group, those are the 3 most effective actions that help us quickly reduce by 2030 towards where we need to be. We did also find in this study that having a child has a very large but long-term climate impact, or carbon legacy, as those authors call it. And I think that's more of a philosophical statement that our current lifestyles and consumption levels are unsustainable. It's not to say, I think it's a piece of information that some people have told me they found useful in considering this very personal choice about having a child. But it's not to say that I'm not recommending this as the way to address our current problem, basically because we already have enough people consuming enough. As you saw, that bucket of our carbon budget is almost exhausted. So the people who are already here and already alive need to figure it out and reduce our emissions. And then we will have a society that is at a sustainable level, which is what we want. I'll talk briefly about food. My family actually has a history of agriculture, including my grandfather playing a role in helping to invent industrial animal agriculture, factory farming of turkeys, which is not something that I'm proud of. But the point here is that basically the way we use land and the way we particularly use animals now is really unsustainable and a big part of our problem, both in climate and land sense and in sort of the relationship that people have with nature and exploiting nature. So essentially what we've done is replace natural biomass with ourselves, our livestock, and the animals that we eat. So when you look at the biomass of life that's alive on Earth right now, mammals, for example, 96% are us or our livestock. And there's only 4% that are wild mammals. Birds is not quite as extreme. We have about 30% wild bird biomass compared with 70% chickens and turkeys and other poultry, but it's still just enormously skewed. So people have really, disrupted this kind of original balance. And this is a really inefficient system. So this study from a few years ago showed that only about 59% of calories that get produced in cropland become food. A lot of it goes to waste by being fed to animals. So when we feed animals crops like soy and wheat and other things that people could eat directly, that's really inefficient. If we weren't doing that, if we weren't feeding our current production of crops to animals, we could feed 4 billion more people. So about 50% more than are alive on Earth today. So I think it's really important to have this mindset of looking at the root cause of problems and thinking about, okay, dietary shifts basically are really important to solving both the biodiversity and climate crises because they are at the root of so many of our problems. And we have to really look at the huge environmental footprint of livestock. So calories and protein, so the benefits that people get from food, are rather small from livestock. But on the other hand, for that rather small contribution of benefits, there are huge costs, including the majority of land and greenhouse gases and water pollution and air pollution that come from the way we use land and agriculture come from producing animals, and about a third of freshwater withdrawals. So it's not a good deal that we have at the moment. It's enormously more efficient to eat plants instead of animals for basically any measure you could look at, including here, greenhouse gases. And all the studies that look at, okay, how are we going to stop the biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity, which is, an agreed international goal. Business as usual is, this kind of sad gray curve of losing this incredible variety and abundance of life on Earth. We can only recover to stable or even increasing biodiversity if we combine all these measures. So both conservation and protection of ecosystems, which your group is very much involved in, as well as sustainable production and also sustainable consumption. And that means shifting to more plant-based diets. I write quite a bit about this in the book, but I'll just briefly say here, incentives are really important. Right now we have subsidies and incentives that are encouraging climate destruction and the destruction of nature, and that makes no sense. So we need economic reforms that basically make it the sustainable thing to do, the most economically profitable and incentivized one. So kind of common sense. I won't go into the detailed strategies here, but just to say that there are lots of plans and ways to do this holistically and move the financial needle in the right direction. There are lots of things also we can do personally. And again, I get into this in some detail in the book, but some of the biggest are breaking up, which I did a few years ago with your mega bank, because they are pretty much all financing fossil fuel infrastructure and exploration and exploitation. So I had an account at Bank of America, which is one of the worst. And I was very happy to close that and switch over to a credit union. I also took a look at my investments and on this Fossil Free Funds website. And that helped me in conversation with an advisor make some shifts within my own personal finances to be in line with my values. Politics is really important. Greta Thunberg is now internationally known. We're very proud to claim her from here in Sweden, but she has been incredible in mobilizing and activating people. But we all have a role to play in politics. And again, I'll try to leave some time for questions. So I won't go into too much detail here, but a recent study kind of summarized basically what is it we have to do through politics to organize our collective action. It's both cultural change, so changes in mindsets and norms, not thinking that it's cool and sexy and desirable to be flying 15 times a year as I was. Building capacity, so practical things for actually changing policies and infrastructures and jobs. And then coming together as beyond individuals to address social movements and coalitions and build shared interests and be able to work together to push politically to overcome entrenched power. And I can recommend this book written by my former student. So I'm biased, but he did a great job where he really summarizes very succinctly the most effective actions, including in politics. And basically what research shows there is voting is really important. There was a study showing voting for women actually reduces emissions, and voting for paying attention to the climate scores, like the League of Conservation Voters has a guide So how have politicians voted for the climate and holding them accountable? Getting active and involved in a political party or an organization, a climate organization, creating media attention, drawing attention to the issue you care about. I just saw a study this morning saying 0.4% of media in 2020 was focused on the climate. And that is obviously way too little. So we really need help in connecting the dots and making that salient to people. Having direct contact with your representatives is shown to be really effective and also really underused. So that's a really important way, either on your own or in collaboration with a group, to have an important impact. And finally, political demonstrations make a big difference. So what are the demands of these? What are the political demands? I mean, basically transitioning off of fossil fuels, having a fair, shutting down infrastructure and not building and financing infrastructure that is leading to climate destruction, giving workers in industries that need to decline for the sake of the climate a just transition. So helping them with job retraining, with early retirement if they're close to retirement, making it possible and fair for people to still have good jobs and even creating new jobs while that are in line with a safe climate. There's legal avenues that are being heard and winning. This Dutch case was really exciting, that a group of young people successfully sued the Dutch government and said, you're not doing enough to meet your Paris Agreement obligations, and it was decided they actually had to do more. And I think that is an important avenue. And then finally, listen to young people. Again, I think their message is really clear: to listen to scientists, to follow the Paris Agreement, to do what's necessary to actually achieve climate stability in our lifetimes. And we know from the science that it is possible. We know from social science some ways to start making it politically possible, and we need everybody on board to help make this happen. So I guess we need cathedral thinking. This is the cathedral in my hometown now of Lund, 900 years old, and this is it doesn't have these solar panels today, so this was an art project, but kind of imagining how can we take what we have and make it better and more beautiful and more fit for purpose for this warming century ahead, and how can we help each other get through it together and work towards these goals of zero emissions, protecting biodiversity and nature, and centering people. So on that, I'll close, and I think we have a few minutes for questions. I would love to see some of you sign up. I have a monthly newsletter where I summarize the science and latest culture on climate and biodiversity. So it's called We Can Fix It, and you can find it over at Substack. My new book is coming out next week, a week from now. So I would be thrilled if you pre-ordered it from your local bookstore online, and you can find more details about both of those things on my website. So thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I would love to hear your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Kimberly. If anybody does have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and come on video to ask questions if you have any.
Well, I have a question if no one else does. Dr. Nicholas, what is the political climate in Sweden? We think of Sweden as pretty progressive, and not just because of Thunberg, but you made the point, you were careful to include them in the general high consumptive society list. What's the state of the environmental movement in Sweden?
You're muted, Kimberly.
Sorry, thank you. Great question. Sweden has a pretty good climate goal, which is to be to reduce emissions 85% by 2045. And be net zero at that time, meaning the 15% of emissions that remain will be taken up by some as yet undetermined mechanism. That's where I'm coming from on kind of cautioning about over relying on nature for sinks. But anyway, we have a pretty good goal. We are not remotely on track to meet it. So we are going about at least four times too slowly with current policies to actually reach that goal. So we at least have the right goals in place. And we have, for example, something called the climate framework that universities have signed on to say we will do our share to be in line with 1.5 degrees. But we don't yet have the policies and the practices in place that are on track to do that. So I would say we're ahead of the US, but we definitely still have quite a long ways to go. If you're interested, you can look more at the Climate Action Tracker categorizes climate pledges and policies by country, and you can see that they're basically, I think Morocco and the Gambia are the only two countries that are in line with 1.5 degrees right now. So two small countries that are quite low emitting, and none of the big emitters are doing enough yet. So we need to go a lot faster.
We have a question from Tim Roberts in the chat. So Tim, feel free, if you'd like to elaborate on your question. Once I'm done, feel free to unmute yourself. But he asks, if we continue to let population grow, won't we hit the unsustainable level no matter what we do? If we move low emitters to become higher emitters and more of them, then do we not exacerbate the problem?
Yeah, great question. So it's certainly true that the more people there are on Earth, the more emissions we have, because being alive and consuming resources is causing climate pollution. At the same time, and we also know that strategies that are good for human development, like educating and empowering women and girls and closing the gender pay gap and making it possible for people of any gender to pursue education and have self-determination, those things, which are human rights, also happen to be good climate policy. So in the sense that they, people in those who have opportunity tend to choose to start families later and have smaller families. So not just for the climate, but because I want to live in a world where girls can go to school, it's a very good idea to educate and empower and close inequality gaps for women and girls. But that said, I do think we have to look, we can't only rely on changes in, I guess I kind of shy away from focusing too much on the population message, because there's actually quite an unhappy history that involves intentional or unintentional racism and kind of finger pointing. I think framing things in terms of population tends to make people think of the problem residing elsewhere, with someone else having too many kids. And it's actually a human right to choose whether and how many kids anyone wants to have. And I think that's sort of the core of what we want to protect from climate breakdown, is have a society where people can make that free choice. That said, we do need to change the kind of consumption patterns that we have. And, you know, that's sort of the data that I was showing today. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Jenna asking, what is your opinion on carbon capture and storage?
So carbon capture can be either natural climate solutions like planting trees and expanding forests, or artificial or engineered climate solutions like direct air carbon capture. I think the short response is we need separate policies and targets for getting to zero emissions, and additionally potentially supporting carbon removal. But what is happening right now is a conflation of the two, and that is very dangerous, because what it means is that there are lots of industries that are planning on using offsets or some kind of technology that at the moment does not exist at scale, hasn't been demonstrated to exist. When we know we have to be reducing emissions somewhere around 10% per year starting now, they're not planning to do that. They're planning on delaying, making it someone else's problem, and basically displacing the problem. So I think carbon uptake from ecosystems, potentially removal in other methods, are worth having worth pursuing. But what's been happening in international climate negotiations and now in business plans is excessive reliance on something that isn't there yet as a way to avoid leaving fossil fuels in the ground. So that I'm very concerned about.
Sorry, trying to keep up with the chat here. So if I skipped over your question, I apologize. But Anne wants to know, how much better are electric cars as opposed to gas in the overall picture?
We did a study that answered that question. So they are about twice as good. Next question. Yeah. Nicholas and Lines, 2017. They definitely are better.
That was a nice short answer.
Yeah.
Mary would like to know, so she says, regeneration is the new buzzword for growth planning. Do you have any thoughts on how to develop regenerative strategies for economic sustainability?
Oh boy, that is a really good and huge question. I mean, I think it's a combination of carrots and sticks. So, I mean, it's basically removing the dumb things that we're doing now, which are incentivized. And, you know, as I said, financially and culturally and otherwise incentivizing the things that we actually want to see more of. It's changes to both production and consumption. I mean, it's hard to give a good short answer. I do try to address this in the economics chapter of my book. I recommend Donut Economics by Kate Raworth if to dive into that a bit more, because I think basically thinking of the economy, the most important thing to me is thinking of the economy as something that needs to exist and thrive within a living planet and within a society that promotes human well-being. That's the main point. And I think the fundamental problem we have now is treating the economy like the most important thing that has to be protected and stabilized. But the economy is a human construct that doesn't even really exist. And I mean, GDP hardly changed last year amidst a lot of human suffering. So it's clear that that's actually not meaningful in terms of what we're actually trying to do here in the human project on Earth. So I think that's why I'm focused on these principles of centering people in nature, getting to the root cause of problems and reducing harm at its source, increasing resilience. But yeah, beyond that, that's a short answer.
Gretchen would like to know, what about flying for eco-travel to see rare species in forest reserves? In some of these situations, local people manage these reserves and act as eco-guides rather than hunting the animals or cutting the forest.
That is a great question. And I honestly don't have a great answer for it because I struggle with that myself. I mean, it's clear that you'll have a huge carbon footprint by doing that. I mean, if you're talking about flying to a tropical country from someplace like the US or Sweden, that will be more than your sustainable carbon budget for the year, just the flight itself. So that is a huge problem. I think in terms of our connection to nature, what the research is increasingly showing is that that's built over time by direct, repeated contact with the nature around us. So in terms of talking about the kind of cultural changes that we need, I think our efforts are better spent in cultivating time outdoors where we are. I just saw that the average American kid spends 4 to 7 minutes playing outside every day and 7 hours on a screen. So of course we have the pandemic at the moment, but I think those numbers are even before that situation. So I mean, that's not going to be solved even by a wonderful 1-week vacation somewhere exotic. That said, the development aspect of it, I do struggle with, and that's not my area of expertise, but I don't know the best answer there. I think I do question whether the kind of model of tourism-based or resource-based economic development is part of a sustainable future. I think it creates a lot of very problematic dynamics that tend to have negative impacts on the local community, even if it's meant to be helpful. So I think locally based empowerment and solutions is probably the way forward, but I don't have a more detailed roadmap than that.
Ganesh asks, is there a global agreement on what the pre-industrial temperature is that we are using as a baseline for limiting temperature increase to less than 1.52 degrees Celsius?
Oh, good question. Yes, pretty much, more or less. I mean, within 0.1 of a degree or so, yes. And as a rough number, it can be taken as 1850, the temperature in 1850. Climate is usually averaged over 30 years because that is necessary to remove the natural variability from year to year. And And if you look at IPCC, if you look at the summary for policymakers in Working Group 1, the latest report, they have a nice analysis that shows, you know, depending on where you take the baseline from, the curve just steepens and steepens. And I mean, it's very clear that the warming we're having now is rapidly increasing kind of regardless of the baseline. I see Jack's question. Yes, Jack. So cars are not good. And that's why our study said so the question is, electric cars being twice as good as gas-based, a polite way of saying they're half as harmful. Yes, in terms of climate pollution, that's exactly what it means. And in terms of other things, they still have the effects of cars, which is they take up a lot of space in cities. They contribute to health problems because it's much better for us to travel actively rather than sitting in a car, both physically and mentally. So I think that's why, you know, we emphasize in our study going car free. And I think that's a really important goal to be aiming for as much as possible, really reducing the need for and dependence on cars. And there are lots of strategies. I have a master's student right now working on that, on the most effective policies to do that. But there are a lot of places that are working to make that happen. I know I'm running over your schedule, so I wonder if we need to wrap up.
That's okay. Yeah, I think that looks like it was the last question kind of in the chat anyway. So that's perfect. Well, Mary just threw one. So that can be the last question. Would be car or airplane free mean using more trains to travel?
Potentially, although I think we also need to kind of reconsider what travel means or looks like. So I have a friend who biked from Stanford in California to the tip of Tierra del Fuego over 2 years. So there's a really adventurous active travel trip. I have a student who built his own raft and rafted the rivers of Denmark, which is not known for its wild rivers, but he had an amazing modern day adventure. So those are, I think, really exciting and interesting examples of ways to travel that aren't involving, you know, fossil fuels at all, or are self-powered. Trains are a much more climate-friendly substitute for either car or plane travel. And for the traveling that we do need to do once we've reduced it as much as possible, that's going to be a much better way forward.